recently, I realized we have a new Kroger's in our area here in Brownsburg, and as we were watching everybody flock to the Kroger's and people coming from the surrounding areas of this town, of this city, coming down on Main Street, there seemed to be a rebirth of energy and participation in this area. While talking to my wife about it, my wife told me that that Kroger's, when they moved out, while they were moving into the other building and until they moved in, they continued to lease the old spot where they were at. So they were on one end of the building and moved to the other end and had a new structure built. And while they were moving to the other end, they kept the lease in the old spot, even though everything that they owned or what was of value was moved out. And so they leased the old spot to keep their competitors out. So while they were moving out, they were keeping occupation in the old location so nobody could move in and benefit or prosper against them. Often when it comes to God being the impossible or the amazing in our lives, it is either the crucifixion of complacency, the comforts of convenience, or death by doubt that murders our opportunities for greater things in Him. Either the crucifixion of complacency, the comforts of convenience, or the death by doubt and fear that murders our opportunities for greater things. Therefore, to obtain what God has for us and to be all that He has intended, we must exit troubling situations to enter God's will for our lives. It requires a moving out of familiar problems and a moving into faith's promises. A moving out of familiar problems and a moving into faith's promises. Saints, from that backdrop, I'd like to talk to you for a subsequent theme just for a few moments from the theme, moving out to move in. Moving out to move in. Moving out to move in. Like an airport, the Christian life is characterized by departures and arrivals. By departures and arrivals. There's no long-term passenger waiting areas at the airport. There are no homeless shelters at the airport. For the Christian, there must be a leaving of sin and an entering of a new level of faithfulness. That is the journey of a believer. There is a continuous departing from disobedience and an entering of obedience. It's overcoming yesterday's losses to accept tomorrow's win. But there is no standing room existence for a believer. If you are in Christ, you are an overcomer. You are continuously leaving yesterday's losses to enter in, to receive and accept tomorrow's wins. Tomorrow's victories. In so many ways, this is where we find the Israelites today as we find them on the brink of their breakthrough. They're wrapping up a 40-year wilderness wandering journey that began as a journey of promise. They're wandering in the wilderness, of Jeffrey Johnson would call it. They've recently traveled 7 miles to a place called Shittim to be at the border of their breakthrough, the border of their promise, the border of their blessing, the doorway of their deliverance. They're resuming the journey, if you will. The journey of promise, if you will, because they're at this stage moving in mourning because Moses, their first prime minister, their George Washington of their America, of their Israel, has just died, and they've spent 30 days mourning him on the plains of Moab, and they've mustered up just enough strength to go 7 miles. What we're talking about from this chapter, Joshua chapter 1 to chapter 3, has the number 7 included. They went 7 miles, and the deliverance will happen in 7 days. I don't know if you know it or not. If you've been in the body of Christ at some point, seen a church house, they said that the number 7 is the number of completion. God said in 7 miles, and deliverance in 7 days. They're resuming the journey. Why resuming the journey? Because as they've been 40 years on this wilderness wandering, that was not the promised journey. They were going in circles, if you will. They said, got me going in circles. Going in circles, if you will. And so what happened is they've moved out of mourning Moses. They've exited Egypt and found out Egypt had not exited them. They had exited Egypt and found out Egypt had not exited them. What they found is a lot of times what we find is there's some things that are going on in our lives that has squatter rights, if you will. Kind of like my wife said in LA, where if you abandon a home or not in a home or it's your vacation home, squatters can come in and stay for a certain amount of time and have rights of ownership even though they've never paid the cost. Sin in the life of a believer is squatters' rights, where sometimes we've come out of some things and those things have not yet come out of us. But we've come out of some people, but they have not yet come out of us. We've left some areas that areas didn't leave us. This is where we find them at. And so what their squatters are is that they've got traditions that were passed down by the deceased elders. Well, I said Egypt had not come out of them, though they came out of Egypt. But truth be told, they had actually never been in Egypt because they're the younger group of the Israeli population. Their elders had came out of Egypt and were slaves making bricks without straw. Their elders were in Egypt worshiping false gods, many gods of the world. But yet their elders, like many of our elders, have passed down traits and traditions about God that has nothing to do with the real, true, living God. And so these traits, the things that they have been told and heard and showed, they're struggling with right now as they're on the brink or the border, the platform of their promise. They're struggling to get Egypt out of them, even though they're nowhere near Egypt. And it's an Egypt they really hadn't been to. There's some things that's been laid on you in life that had really nothing to do with you, that was really laid on you, and you still trying to struggle to get out of it. They're wilderness living. They were born in the wilderness environment. They were born in environments that were not like God. They were taught things and experienced and observed things that have nothing to do with Jesus, had nothing to do with promise, that had more to do with despair and depression, but nothing to do with deliverance and overcoming. And so this is what they're dealing with, because God has called this people who really weren't a people to go in and possess a land that had never possessed anything. And the interesting thing is that with their parents at least had homes in Egypt, but these children that are adults now were born in an area where there was no possession because they were always wandering to and fro. They were the people that you would know in your neighborhood that they moved every time the rip man came. These were those people, so they're going in. God said, I'm going to give you this building. You're about to possess this land. I'm going to give you this mansion, and they've never had a pot or the window to throw it out of. And so it's hard for them to believe that God is taking them to this promised land that they've never owned anything. They got about to get everything and they've never owned nothing. But much like people that travel through different time zones, what they find is that their bodies are still operating in an old time zone. One of the things that when you go to LA that you probably experienced at different places in the world, when we went to LA, we went on a Friday. We left Indianapolis at 4 o'clock and got there, which would have been, 7 o'clock or 8 o'clock on our time, and ended up it being 4 o'clock again their time. Our body was tired like it was 7 or 8 o'clock Indianapolis time, but we were in sunshine time. Though we were located in our body and our experience was still responding to where we came from. Have you ever operated in two different time zones? Are you in God's family still acting like your old family? Or are you in AC after Christ still operating like BC before Christ? Are you still thinking some ways that you shouldn't be thinking? The question on the table is, whose family does your life look like? Are you living a life of choice and entitlement or surrender and service? A life of choice and entitlement or surrender and service? Because God's family is about surrender and service, not choice and entitlement. This is what they're walking into. There's some things that he wants to deal with them. The question really on the table is, what bondage do you need to break out of? Well, what's holding you back? What's keeping you from the deliverance that you want? Well, what's keeping you from the blessing that you're after? Why have you not achieved what you've been going after, what you thought you should have, what you've been working towards? Hebrews 12 identifies this bondage this way. He says this: therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely. Since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and sin, which clings so closely, as Hebrews 12:1, the A clause. Simply put, our bondage are those things or situations that are weighing heavy on our minds. Those things that hinder a life of faith, those things that when we want to get up and go, we end up laying down and staying. My daddy said, don't sit, stay, lay, and play. The challenges with our faith, those bondages, the things that are keeping us locked up, are the things that when we want to do, they urge us to don't. We want to go, but we end up staying. What is that thing that's keeping you from moving forward? They are the clouds of despair and hopelessness that leads to us seeking solutions and success by our own means. What's going on in you or in your life that's making you look for a relief, that's making you look for your own V8? What is that bondage? See, it's that sin that he's talking about that we're choosing our desires over God's desires, pleasing ourselves instead of him. Looking at our subject text will help us figure out what theirs was. Stay with me because it's a little bit different than what I thought it'd be. But it says, then Joshua, at our subject verse 5, then Joshua said to the people, consecrate yourselves, for tomorrow the Lord will do amazing things among you, wonders among you. Wonders mean amazing. God's going to do a miracle. He's going to do the impossible. But he says, consecrate yourselves. That phrase, consecrate yourselves, helps us to understand that what they're facing, the challenge on deck, is not exclusive to their external realities. What they're dealing with is not only what's going on around them. Their problem is not just their environment. And like you and I, like myself, your problems a lot of times may not just be the things around you. It might not just be where you are. It might not just be who's talking to you or get on your nerves. It might not just be what you don't have. It might not be what you want or what you're feeling that you don't want to be feeling. See, he's saying that consecrate yourselves. Because notice, if you look at the verse, he says consecrate yourselves. But look what he doesn't say. He doesn't say consecrate the river, because they're on the brink of the Jordan. This Jordan is at flood stage, and this is the thing that they got to cross over to get into the promise that God has given them. Now, mind you, I just told you that they're dealing with things that they just came out of, trying to get Egypt out of them, even though they had never been to Egypt per se. They're trying to get the things that mama and daddy said that's in their minds. When daddy and mama said they couldn't do this, they couldn't do that, or their brothers and sisters or their frenemies said, you'll never be this and you'll never be that. They're trying to get the doubt out of their minds. They're trying to get the grieving out of their mind, what they've just lost, who's not with them for the journey that they thought was going to be with them for the journey. They got to cross over without somebody that they thought was going to help them get over. He's saying you got to consecrate yourself. See, they, on top of what they were already dealing with, now have a new hurdle in front of them. And it's a river that they've never crossed. Now, if you've ever dealt with the Bible, ever been in church on Easter or Christmas, you've heard of the Red Sea. You know of Moses. You said Moses, who was their enemy, the verse starts the book off, which says that Moses had died. Now, Moses, as I said, was their George Washington on deck. He's the only person that they had ever seen leading them. What's interesting is that every time they heard something from God, it came from Mo. Every time they were supposed to go and get a benefit or a breakthrough or a blessing, it was Mo leading the charge. But now they're talking about going to get a blessing, and Mo's not on deck. Mo is nowhere to be found, and they know Mo will never come back. Mo has gone to be with the Lord. Yesterday is gone and is not coming back. And so what happens is he says that on top of that, he said that you're facing this river, this thing that's in your way. And he says, you got to consecrate yourselves. It's because, see, we're not only seeking to consecrate. See, most of the time we want to deal with what's outside of us. We want to consecrate the thing that is getting on our nerves. We want to consecrate the person that is getting on our nerves. We want to consecrate the finances we don't have, the health that's not acting right, the people that are in our lives that we'd like to be out of our lives, the people that we want to change, the job that we want to change, the car that we want to drive better, the school that we want to end fast. These are the things that are around us. Then you can put your own in if I didn't call it out. Those things that are going on around us that we want to consecrate those. See, the high water is not the only thing that's going on in their lives. Question, are you in a flood right now? Because it says that with the Jordan, that one of the things of a flood, I don't know if you've ever seen one, but here's the thing what a flood does. A flood has water that overflows its borders. And it doesn't just overflow its border to drip over the edge. It generally is water running into areas that it had no business into. Do you have some things in your life that's going over into other things that it has no business into? Are you affected, one thing affecting another thing that it has no communication or connection with? This is what he's telling me. He said that this flood is not just crossing over, it's actually coming towards them. They got to go over it, but it's still coming towards them. So whether they want to go or not, the closer they get to it, the closer it's going to get to them. But I keep saying, he says, consecrate yourselves. What is he saying? He says, don't consecrate what's outside of you. He said, consecrate yourself. See, consecrate yourselves indicate that God was using Joshua to point out an enemy that they didn't see. The enemy was the only thing that Joshua told them to strategically plan against. Now, mind you, when they're going over the flood, they got enemies that are trained warriors. You would have thought God would have told them to get some bricks and some sticks and some guns and stuff like that to be ready for the battle when they got over into the land. But much like the pilgrims did with the Indians, you would have thought that as they entered that new land, they would be prepared to take over. But this is not what he told them. He said, consecrate yourselves, consecrate your family, consecrate your job, consecrate your husband, consecrate your wife, consecrate your sister, consecrate your mama, consecrate your boyfriend, consecrate your finances. No, he didn't say that. Joshua said, consecrate yourselves. He said that the primary obstacle preventing you and I from breaking into our blessing and getting over yesterday's losses is us. He said the enemy was them all along. He said, you're sleeping, I'm sleeping, likely sleeping with the enemy. God's telling them that they are their worst enemy. It reminds me of the great quote by Michael Corleone in The Godfather. I know that my wife don't want me to mention that, but I got to give it to you. Michael Corleone said it this way: keep your friends close and your enemies closer. Keep your friends close and your enemies closer. Satan has a way of using that to keep our friends close and our enemies closer. He does that by the doubt and despair that he keeps close to us, that's often masquerading in what I like, what I think, what I always do, and how I feel. We are the enemies that Satan keeps closer to us than we think. See, we think it's the people right there that's the problem, but our enemies are closer to us than our friends. The people, your friends, are the things that you're saying getting on your nerves, but the reality is Joshua is saying that what's keeping you out of where you're going has nothing to do with who you're around. It's all about who's in you. It's all about what's going on in you. It's how you're responding to what you're dealing with. It's how you're treating who you don't like. It's what you're saying about what you don't like. It's what you're thinking about what you don't like. It's how you want to approach what you don't think you can have. It's how you listen to what they said yesterday, so you got yesterday blocking tomorrow and today. You can't move into your faith journey because you're stuck on responding to yesterday's madness. He said the reality is you can't change what they think, what they do or won't do. The reality is it's about how you're responding to where you are. You can't change the River Jordan. You're right there. Yes, I know it's a problem. I know they're doing it. I know you're tired of it. But the reality is the only thing you can change is change yourself. He said, could you be the problem that's blocking your blessing? He tells them after this 7-year journey, they are their problem blocking their blessing. They just came out of Egypt and all these things were factual. They wasn't worshiping God. Moses died. They didn't believe. It was some doubt on deck. All those things were factual. Their mamas and daddies wasn't there no more, taught them things that had nothing to do with God. That is all true. But God said that the thing that is interrupting you from getting to where I'm calling you is you. It's how you're carrying the load on those things. I need you to do a Teddy Pendergrass, have another love TKO. I need you to let it go. I need you to let go of the things that don't love God. If they don't love what God is calling you to do, you need to let that go. If it doesn't love God that's calling you and wants to bless you, you need to let it go. If it's yesterday's madness, let it go. If God is telling you to go forward, I've got things for you to do and be, and they say that you can't and you never will, you need to let it go. Another love TKO. You got to let go what doesn't love God, what doesn't love God's will for your life. When he tells them to consecrate themselves, what he's really telling them is you got to wash the clothes, have sexual abstinence, and remove all things common or unclean. Generally, this is a ritual cleaning because God is so holy that he wants nothing around him that has nothing to do with him. This is what happens when Jesus dies on the cross and dies for our sins. Jesus is, in essence, offering a doorway for us to be consecrated, for us to be washed and clean in the spirit. So what's on us, the stains of our traditions, the stains of Egypt in our lives, so those things don't get in the way what God has to do in us and through us. He said that you got to consecrate. But what's interesting is that when he told them to wash themselves up and to consecrate themselves, because they were going into the promised land the next day, they didn't have time to wash their clothes. They would be like our house was over the weekend. The hot water went out, and so they wouldn't have been able to wash their clothes in hot water to sterilize what needed to be sterilized. All I'm saying is that because they were so close to their breakthrough, there wasn't enough time to do the things that they normally did to get right. You on the precipice of your breakthrough. You at the doorway of your deliverance, the brink of your blessing, and you don't have time to keep operating the way you used to operate. You can't put it off like you've been putting it off. You can't say, I'll get better tomorrow. You can't say next year, because you know and I know that tomorrow is not promised. When God has a call for you to do, you got to move out in that call. I don't know if you know it or not. Have you ever heard that delayed obedience is nothing more than total disobedience? Delayed obedience, delaying what God has told you to do, putting off the plan, is total disobedience to God. You have totally rejected him, and God will not deal with you in a spirit of partiality as you trying to operate with him. He said, no, you totally walked in unbelief against what I promised for you, and therefore you can't make it into what I've opened up for you. He said, you got to observe this. Every time you see consecrate yourselves in the Bible, what happens is this is a command, not a suggestion. When God is telling you to consecrate yourself, he's not saying, I think you should, you might want to, I don't know, it could help you, you might want to consider it. He said, I'm telling you, and sometimes for the last time, to consecrate yourselves. It's a command, it's an order. And if God is your commanding officer, if Jesus is not just your Savior, but also your Lord, the one you sacrifice and surrender to, then you got no choice but to do what he said to do. I don't care if they go with you. I don't care if they come against you. You got to do what God said do. You got to consecrate yourself. The command of God to consecrate or to purify their lives was to indicate that at times our greatest need for change must be initiated by God. What do I mean? He tells them to consecrate themselves through Joshua. The interesting part is they don't tell themselves consecrate themselves. God is saying when spiritual transformation has to happen, most of the time it is initiated by a word from God. And God is just requiring a response. God is not telling you to go to the hospital and put on the stethoscope and then play the victim, the sick person, the patient. He said, no, you can't play both parts. God said that when I want you to be transformed, to purify your life so I can get you into what I got for you, I'm the one that's going to initiate that call. A lot of times it'll be places like this where you're in a church house and you hear the Spirit of God as the preacher's preaching, and he's saying one word, but you're hearing different words that are coming out of that word that pertains specifically to what God has revealed to you and what you're going through. God said this command is something that I initiate, and you understand it specifically for you, for what you're going through and what I've revealed, what I've told you to do. And so he said, you've got to act this out. It starts with God. So if you're sitting here today or if you're online today and God has said, I need you to consecrate yourself, and something happened to pop up in your mind that you know ain't right with God, that's the thing that God is not suggesting. That's the thing that God is charging, God is commanding, God is demanding for you to come out of. Not tomorrow, not next week, but right now. Right now. And sometimes that thing just might be doubt and fear. Sometimes it might be depression. Sometimes it might be the hurts of yesterday because you're uncertain about what tomorrow's blessings will bring. He said today, not yesterday, but right now. He said you got to come out of that thing. See, the context and why he does this, what makes this even more heightening, is that Joshua is a new leader on deck. And this is his first time speaking to the people of Israel directly himself. This is his inaugural address. He's at the inauguration, if you will. And the thing that he comes out with is not how he's going to make them better. how he's going to lead like Moses, how he's going to be like the last president and do more than he did. No, what he calls them to do, God said, what I want you to do is I want you to call them to a greaterness in me and not focus on you, but to focus on themselves, because the temptation was to look at Joshua and the thing where he's not like the pastor I had before. He's not like Moses. You know, this is his first day on the job. He ain't been up there but 10 minutes or so. Who is he to be calling us to do that? No, God said, what I need you to do is I need you to tell them they got to get right with me, that the thing that's blocking them from getting over into their blessing is not that I'm a new leader on deck. No, the thing that's blocking them from getting to the promise is that you don't see me in the new leader. See, you don't see Joshua as one that's calling you to walk into your deliverance. And so when Joshua speaks, preaches, or talks, you take it as just a word from somebody you know, somebody you've seen. Because, see, they were acquainted with Joshua. Joshua was Moses' servant. So for 40 years, when Moses would walk, Joshua would walk. It would be Aaron and Josh. And so the reality is when Josh got up there, they said, that's just Josh talking. And God said, well, I want you to help them understand that as long as you see Joshua as Gene, you'll never get to the promised land you're supposed to get to. You'll never see Brownsburg as a promised land. You'll never see being the glass of Christ in this area. You'll never see that. And he said, the problem ain't with Josh, the problem's with you, because God is speaking and the Spirit is confirming, but yet you're rejecting by disobedience. See, Joshua gets up there and he tells God tells him that this is my primary concern. And you got to realize that Joshua's up there knowing that he's been around Moses and know the temptation is they're not going to hear him like they heard Mo. Remember 80 years ago, when Mo had to get up there, Mo was worried about stuttering and staggering too. Remember, I can't speak. I'm not one learned in words. And God said, you're a low-down, bold-faced lie because you've been trained in the president's house, in Pharaoh's house. You had the best teachers. So, boy, I know you know how to talk. You was able to talk when you killed that Egyptian. But all of a sudden you got hush mouth now. And so Joshua is going through the same things that a new leader goes through on deck, where he has to internally struggle with his calling as well while he's championing the call of God that's outside of himself and beyond anything he can do to a people that's looking at him as less than what he is in Christ. He said, my primary concern, Joshua, is for them to understand I need them to get closer to me. I need them to get close to me. And you said, why is this? Why is this? In chapter 3, a few verses down, around verse 15, look what it says. Verse 11 actually says this. He says, behold, the ark of the covenant of the Lord, and all the earth is passing over before you, and into the Jordan. Now, therefore, take 12 men of the tribes of Israel, from each tribe a man. And he says, when the soles of your feet of the priests bearing the ark of the Lord of all the earth shall rest in the waters of the Jordan, the waters of the Jordan shall be cut off, flowing, and the waters coming down from above stand in one heap. He's saying, I'm about to do a Red Sea all over. Joshua, I'm about to show them who I am. They about to see some things come true that you said was going to come true. But look what he says in verse 15. In verse 15, he says this. No. Let me go back. It's verse 10. He says this. Why he said all of what I just read. This is why he says it. And this is the purpose. He said, and Joshua said, here's how you shall know that the living God is among you, and that he will without fail drive out from before you the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Hivites, and the Perizzites, the Girgashites, the Amorites, the Jebusites, and the Shilites. He said this, the way you understand that is this. There was something that they needed to know. They wanted to know, one, is God in this thing? Right now I'm preaching. You say, there's God in this? God said, the way you going to know that I'm present, that I ain't left you because your leader's gone. I ain't left you because the one you look to ain't here for you to look at. I ain't left you because it don't look like yesterday. I'm still here. But then he says, the way you know that I'm with you today, let me tell you about what's going to happen with your tomorrow. Because the reality is when you're on the precipice of your promise, and you're entering new environments and new realities in Christ and God and what he's called you to deal with, it don't look like it used to. And you need to first know that God is both in that thing and that both has that thing covered. That he's with you today, but he'll also be with you tomorrow. Because look at what he says. He said, the way you're going to know, look, he didn't say about the river. He said, the way you know I'm going to conquer what you got to go deal with tomorrow, he said, well, I don't know if I can be this. I don't know if I can do that. I've never done that. Everybody said I couldn't do it. I don't know if I'm going to be able to handle this. I don't know if I'm going to be able to come this. Mama ain't here no more. How I'm going to keep going? I'm used to her being here. But the struggle that we dealing with, how I'm going to do that? How I'm going to overcome this sickness? How I'm going to overcome these financial challenges? How I'm going to overcome somebody getting on my everlasting nerve? How I'm going to overcome work? How I'm going to do that? God said, well, I know you got this big hurdle in front of you right now, but let me tell you about your tomorrow. And so then he tells them about their tomorrow, about telling them what he's about to do today. Because this is when he says that the waters of the Jordan, when you put your feet in there, are going to open up. He said when the priests put their feet in there carrying the Ark of the Covenant, see, the Ark was a new revelation of God. Usually it was Moses and his staff that opened up the Red Sea. Remember, Moses put the staff out, it opened up while they were crying and complaining. This time they're crying internally. They're not crying out. It's in their emotions. God has read their hearts and say, let me help y'all go forward. And so he says, Joshua, what I want you to do, because he says later, the way I'm going to elevate you, or earlier, I'm going to elevate you in front of them so they'll know that I'm with you like I was with Moses, because I know they worried about that too. Yeah. I'm worried about, is this our real leader? Is God really calling this guy? Can I follow him? And then is God going to be with us while we following him? And is God going to carry us into tomorrow? Because I don't know if he's here today. He said, let me help you know that. He said, when the priests put their feet in the ark, in the water, he said, that mug's going to open up. Now remember the last time they had, Moses just put the staff out there and that mug parted. God said that you got to put some feet into that thing. He said, you gotta step in that thing. You gotta invest in what God is doing for you to see God part the thing that you thought was going to overcome you. Because before he said you're going to go over the Jordan, but when he says put your foot in, they actually go through it. He said, Joshua, this thing that you're facing right now is the guarantee of your tomorrow. This thing that you think is going to take you out right now, this spirit of doubt, this spirit of fear, spirit of worry, healthcare issues, financial issues, conflict in the family, work issues, whatever it may be, uncertainty in society, whatever that may be, God says that it's this thing that I'm going to use as the guarantee of your tomorrow. I'm going to make you triumph today to give you confidence by tomorrow. God will help you conquer today so you can be a confident conquering tomorrow. And so when he says consecrate yourselves, he said that you got to pay close attention to yourself. What he's saying is that Jesus says it this way. He says that be in the world, but not of the world. Be in the world, not of the world. He's basically talking like a boat. He's saying boats are great when they're in the water, but you know a boat ain't worth a broken canoe when water's in it. He said you got to be in the world, not of the world. It means that you have to be one that is a world changer, not letting the world change you. That's what he told his disciples. He says it this way. He says it Paul says that consecration, here it is now. This is what it is. I'm about to wrap this up. Here's what consecration is. Consecration is setting apart to be set forth for servicing God. God is devoting you to sacredness. He's calling you to service. There must be some separation when God calls you to service. If you've ever known anybody that's ever went into the army or the armed forces, what's the first thing that they do after they enlist? Mom and daddy walk them down to wherever they go to get on that boat or plane to go do basic training. Meaning there must be some separations from where they are and a setting forth to where they're going so they can be reoriented to who they're called to be. They get a uniform and some boots. Been taught you got to shine your shoes now and all that. You got to do some exercises that you wasn't doing. There's some consecrating. There's a separating from, a moving out of, and a moving into. God said the move out you got to make is move out of yourself and move into him. And so Paul says it this way in 2 Timothy. This is our theme verses for our church, actually. 2 Timothy 2:20 and 21. Now in a great house there are not only vessels of gold and silver, but also of wood and clay, some for honorable use, some for dishonorable. Therefore, if anyone cleanses himself from what is dishonorable, hear this now, he will be a vessel for honorable use. If he cleanses himself from what is dishonorable, he will be useful for God. Set apart as holy, useful to the master, to the house, and ready for good work. I'm almost done, I promise you. Just give me 2 minutes and we wrapped up. So basically that word is translated holy, consecrate. I mean, God is making you like him. When he says consecrate, he said, become like me. Step away from that world, become like me. See, 1 Timothy 4 and 16, Paul says it this way, and I think it gives us, he said, you got to keep a close watch on yourself and on the teaching. Persist in this, for by so doing, you will save both yourself and your hearers. He says, keep a close watch on yourself. Now, generally, this is actually a word to a pastor. This is what I got to do. And you said, how did he take Joshua, that new leader? Why would Joshua say, consecrate yourselves? Because before God called Joshua to tell them to consecrate themselves, he told Joshua to consecrate himself. So Joshua was actually just giving them a message that God had gave him already for him. When I'm up here preaching, a lot of times the message is given to me first about me and then shared out to y'all. As if I was singing in the shower and y'all was standing outside of the door, if you was my wife saying, stop singing. And I'm preaching this word that you hear outside the door. This is what he says, that if you're going to be a vessel for me, you got to start keeping a close watch on yourself and not on others. That means that you also, in one sense, you see what needs to come out of you. But in another sense, as you see what comes out of you, you also get to see what is in you. See, if you start looking and stop listening so much to what they've been saying and start looking into yourself, the things that you've been doing, a lot of times you've been demonstrating gifts that God has given you. You don't even know. You've been doing it for other people. Now God said, I want you to do it for me and for yourself. He said, but if you won't keep a close watch on yourself and you keep listening to what they've said you're not, you'll never be able to deal with it. See, they had to keep a close watch on themselves because others will be watching them as they enter the promised land. All of the unbelievers, all the people around you that don't know Christ, like you know Christ, are watching you. And God said, I need you to look like me so they'll see me in you. And so because this is a command, the question that we got to ask anytime we're dealing with God or in Scripture is this. The first question is, what has God showed us about himself? When he says consecrate yourself, moving out to move in, what has he showed us today? But one of the things he showed us is that God requires for us to be like him and to shed those things in our lives that are not like him. God will only use those that are interested in getting closer to him and looking like him. And then it says, the second question is, what must we do based on what God has told us about him? Since God says he wants us to consecrate ourselves and he wants us to be holy like he's holy, he wants us to be a witness for him in our delivering zone where he delivers us. What do we do with that? See, it was a command, not a suggestion. We have to ask ourselves, what are the boundaries that's getting in the way of us, the bondage that's getting in the way of us dedicating ourselves to God? What are the things that are in our lives that are unlike Jesus? What's coming to your mind right now when I'm saying that God would bless me, but God, if I could stop doing this, if I could get away from him, her, or them, if I can make this, if I didn't hurt this way, if I was raised in this family, if I just had this amount, if somebody would just help me do this. What is that thing that God has showed you that he wants you to step away from and step into? God said, in order for you to benefit in the store, in the community that God has for you to benefit in and influence it, you got to be like Kroger's and eventually let the lease go. You got to let the lease go and realize that God has given you a new building. And it doesn't matter who moves in that building because God has given you a new thing. See, in the business sense, it seemed like Kroger's was being smart because they leased the building so their competitors couldn't move in. But in reality, they really weren't. They were operating in a fear complex. Because if God has given you the finances and the wherewithal to build a new structure, and people all coming in there, why are you worried about who's going in the old spot? Right. If God has given you a new vision, a new deliverance, a new hope, a new healing, why are you so focused on the old hurts? Why are you trying to fix that when God said fix this in me? Moving out to move in. Let's pray. You stand